Well, hey everyone, it's Hudson. Some of you might be new to this channel because you got a Z9 and you're looking for a setup guide. Others of you have been clamoring for the setup guide. Well, it's finally here. For those of you who might be new, I hope you'll check out my Thursday videos. I put up a video every Thursday about all kinds of things photographic, from creative visioning to gear videos like this, to talking about trips and locations and inspiration and other photographers. So, check it out. All right. We're going to dive in. This is one to buckle up for. This is where I'm going to go through and I'm going to talk about my standard setup of this camera. We're going to talk about banks with the Z9. I'm going to talk a little bit about the controls of the Z9. I'm going to talk about how to customize those controls. The banks are a bit of a confusion for a lot of people, I think, and we're going to go through and show you how to utilize those, how to copy those banks to other positions and set them up. And I don't necessarily recommend you set everything up exactly like mine. I constantly get people saying, well, just send me a backup file of your settings and I'll load it to my camera. But if you don't understand why my settings are the way they are, it's going to be of beyond limited use to you. It's just going to make your camera hard to control. So I want you to kind of watch through this. This is going to be a longer video because I'm going to go through all the menus in this camera. And I think if you've been messing around with this camera much, you know that the downloadable reference guide, which I recommend you put on your phone or your tablet, is 1,000 pages long, just almost. And I've been through it, and I've been through this camera. And luckily, this camera has kind of a built-in settings guide. You can see there's a little question mark up here. When you have shooting bank menu or shooting menu bank highlighted, you can hit that little question mark. You can either hit the question mark icon, which is also the zoom out button on the back, or just touch the screen, and it'll tell you about what shooting banks are. The camera has kind of a built-in user guide for a lot of settings, not everything. But I still think you should have that more detailed reference guide on your phone. So we're going to go through, we're going to talk about all the settings, and I'll show you how I set up my camera for 4 different situations using the custom settings bank and the photo shooting and video shooting bank menus. And those situations are standard, action, landscape, and astro. And I'm going to basically walk through standard in this video. It'll be a longer video. It'll go through all the menu settings. And then I'll show you how you copy that to the other banks before going in to customize them to set them up for situations like action photography and landscape photography and astrophotography. And I think it's really important, these menu banks, this camera is complicated enough and you want to set it up differently for different situations enough that having a shortcut to get to the settings that you want for a given situation is really important. Your situations that you shoot might be different than mine. You might be a macro photographer or a portrait photographer. You might be really into flash photography and you want to set these menus up differently, but looking at how I do mine's probably going to be illustrative for you. The thing I would say is that these banks are not locked in place. They are bookmarks, essentially. When you're working in A, wherever you are, when you leave bank A to go into a different shooting menu bank, it'll remember exactly where you were in bank A when you come back to it. So it's also important to get this camera set up the way that you really like and then back up those settings so that you can reload them at the end of the day after you've been tweaking settings in all the different banks and get them right back to where you're used to them being. If along the way you stumble upon some tweaks that you really like and you want to keep, well then leave those in place and save your settings one more time. All right, so we'll talk through this. Right now, again, we're only going to go through the standard, my A menu bank. When you go in and you look at the menu banks, there's a shooting menu and shooting menu banks for both photo and for video. Video recording menu, photo shooting menu. If I go up, you can see there's a sorry, let me go in here. Get a little less confusing. So we're at the top of the video recording menu, has the same link of banks. They're the same exact banks. Those are tied together. One set of banks works for both the video menu and the photo menu. You can tap with your finger to switch between these main menus with the camera or the video, and you can use the D-pad. You can move your arrow to the right. I'll show you how you rename these things. We're working on the standard one. We're only going to be working on A here. You can move over to the right, and there's a choice to rename. You can move over to the right, and you can tap in here and delete characters and add characters, and you can touch the screen to put, OQ if you want. You can go back over the O with your finger touch and hit delete and get rid of those. So you can type in, I've got standard 4K 24, those are video settings. Like I told you, these shooting menu banks are tied together. The video and the photo are all tied to one set of banks. So if you want to have some video settings locked in, we're not going to go deep into flash or video settings, but that's how I set mine up. For the standard kind of shooting that I do, it's 4K, 24 frames a second. I'll show you how I do that in a second. All right. There's this next menu item is extended menu banks. When that's activated, you can either touch it or you can push to the right to turn it on and off. I leave it turned on. And what that does is it locks in what mode you're shooting in, what exposure mode. So manual mode, shutter priority mode, aperture priority mode, program mode, and what your actual exposure settings are. You know, if you're at the widest aperture, your lens will go in aperture priority mode with auto ISO turned on. It's going to remember that when you go back into that photo shooting bank A again. So I leave that set up. I think it's really handy. That's my choice. Storage menu, you can rename the storage folder that the images go into on the memory card. File naming, you can change the name of the files. You can put it to your initials, whatever. I just leave it to default. It makes it easy for me to know it was shot on a Nikon, since I use other types of cameras too. Roll played by card and slot 2. This is where you want to go into. If you want to back your images up so that every single image goes to a compact flash express card in slot A and B and back everything up. You know, sometimes I know the high-end event and fashion photographers want to do that because the clients are paying so much money. Maybe someone on assignment to a really remote location and the images are once in a lifetime. In general, I've just never had problems with compact flash express cards. So I'm going to use the overflow setting, which you can always hit this little question mark like I talked about before, and it'll describe what overflow means. Essentially it means when it runs out of room in slot 1, it's going to start moving the images into slot 2. And I use slot 2 for video. I direct the video go there. I'll show you how I do that. Image area, that's where you could choose to shoot in a DX crop if you wanted, or square. I tend to mostly run in FX, but sometimes with wildlife or sports and I'm using a long lens and it's not quite long enough, I'll jump into DX mode and still be shooting at 24 megapixels. I still get the nice big image through my viewfinder as if it was not in a crop mode, and I get a much deeper buffer with those smaller files. It can be handy if you know you need to crop anyway. Why bring those big files to crop away? Image quality, and I'm going to put that, I'll show you, I'm going to put that on a button in the action mode that we go to so you can flip back and forth really easily with a function button. Image quality. This is where you can go and choose, you know, do you want to just shoot basic RAW or do you want to shoot RAW plus a JPEG? When the JPEG has a star by it, you know, basic is not as high a quality as normal, is not as high a quality as fine. Star is a little higher quality than standard. So I'm shooting RAW plus a normal quality JPEG that's a little erring towards the side of quality over compression. Until Adobe has the full real profile for this camera, I think the JPEGs are kind of nice to have. Image size, particularly with these JPEGs, how big are they? I'm going to just shoot full resolution 46 megapixels, 45.4 megapixels. Medium resolution is like a 24 megapixel. Small is that 11.4 mode. I'm just going to leave it in the full size file mode. How much compression is being applied to your RAW file? What's your priority? Smaller files or higher quality? I use a lossless compression. There's no uncompressed option with this camera, but lossless compression is beautiful. I don't notice any kind of compression problems. High efficiency with a star is a little higher quality than high efficiency without the star. It errs towards higher quality than compression. High efficiency without the star errs towards compression. So those are just some settings you can play around with. I'm leaving it at lossless. ISO sensitivity settings, you can set what is the ISO I want to run at as my base ISO. You know, 64 is going to be your highest quality images in this camera. And then your auto ISO, do you have that turned on or not? In my standard mode, running around, I tend to run in aperture priority mode with auto ISO turned on, and I kind of keep an eye on ISO, but you know, I'm choosing how much of my image is going to be in focus, what part's in focus. And I want to focus on composition and using auto aperture priority with auto ISO lets the camera make decisions that free me up to focus on my composition in sort of general street shooting, travel photography type scenarios. I can set the maximum ISO sensitivity either without flash or with flash if you're using an external flash. And I choose to let the camera choose the minimum shutter speed based on what lens I happen to be using at the moment. So, if it's a 100mm lens, it's going to be choosing a little higher shutter speed than if I'm shooting with a 14mm lens. The camera's really smart that way. I just let it make those decisions for me. White balance. You can go in, you can see I'm in auto white balance. If I keep pushing over to the right, you can choose whether you want it to be a little warmer, keep the overall atmosphere, or reduce warm colors. That's a personal taste. I'm leaving it at the kind of warmer. You've got all the normal white balance choices that you would normally have. Now, because we're shooting raw, it doesn't matter all that much. You can always adjust that raw file in the aftermath, but your JPEG is going to have those colors baked in. Very hard to change. So if you're shooting JPEGs, it makes a huge difference. Picture control, again, big deal for JPEGs. I choose flat. It's going to determine what the image on the back of your camera or through your viewfinder as you're reviewing images look like. It's going to generate a little JPEG even if you're just shooting straight raw, with that picture profile built in, and it's going to build a histogram based on that picture profile. If you were to choose vivid, it's going to be super saturated, very contrasty, dark darks, white whites. That histogram isn't going to look like the real raw file that's being saved. It's going to look like the vivid JPEG that would have been created if you were in JPEG mode. That's why I choose flat. It gives me a more accurate histogram based on the raw file that I'm capturing and a more accurate look at an unedited raw file. If you're shooting JPEGs, you might want to choose, play around, see what the look you like is. You can create your own looks with picture control. You can go in and change the sharpening and saturation and contrast and everything else. Color space, one of the first things I always change in my camera, I move it to Adobe RGB. Particularly, images that I want to edit, I want them in a nice, wide color profile. sRGB is a very narrow color profile built for the web and for sharing images online. Adobe RGB is more of an editing color space. It's big and wide, lets you move around when you're editing without clipping color. I even move it into a wider color gamut than that when I create, say, a Photoshop document to edit. I use ProPhoto RGB, which is even wider than Adobe, but I have the camera create Adobe RGB files. Active D lighting, that's going to apply to JPEGs. It does kind of an HDR thing with bringing shadow tones out without overexposing highlights. I generally leave it off. Long exposure noise reduction, that's something that's great if you're shooting in, with a neutral density filter and doing a really long exposure, or you're doing Milky Way work, because long exposures, sometimes you get hot pixels and sensor defects, and they're different depending on how warm it is outside and what the humidity is in the current night and just how long you've been shooting through the day and what the sensor state is. So what this does is it creates a second exposure with a dark slide. It just doesn't expose the sensor to the light. It exposes your image that you asked it to take for, say you did a 10-second exposure. Then it's gonna expose the sensor with no light for 10 seconds and compare that dark slide to the image you just took and get rid of anything that it sees that's a defect with it. Should just be pure black, and you get a much cleaner image. You want to turn that on or off based on whether you have the time to do it and whether you have the need for it. I use it a lot in Milky Way photography and long exposure, but it takes twice as much time to make every single image. High ISO noise reduction. I leave that on normal just to get some noise reduction on my JPEG files when I'm shooting RAW plus JPEG, but it's not going to apply to the RAW file anyway. So it doesn't really matter for RAW file shooters. Same thing with vignette control, diffraction compensation, distortion control, photo flicker. This is a thing where it's looking for lights that are flickering and trying to time the shutter to not have as much flicker in your image. That can kind of cause some shutter lag, so I leave that turned off. Again, hit that little question mark up in the top right corner, and it's got a built-in manual that tells you all this stuff right on the screen. So the camera's got its own manual kind of built in. Metering, again, I tend to run in matrix metering 95% of the time. Flash control, we're not going to go deep into flash control, but for off-camera flash or on-camera flash, all your controls are there. I'm going to put that in my menu so I can do flash work. Focus mode, now this is important. This is locking it into my standard knock-around A mode shooting menu bank, and I'm choosing autofocus continuous mode with 3D area mode. I could also choose to be in AFS, which locks focus on a subject and doesn't continue to track it once it's captured the focus. Continuous continues to track moving subjects. Manual focus, you're manually focusing, kind of built in. AF area mode, you've got all these different AF area modes. I love 3D tracking as kind of my tried and true just knock around mode. I have one point out there that I'm choosing that I can move around. You see how I'm using my little joystick to move that point around, and I can put it on a person or an animal or a car or a vehicle or a subject of any kind, whether it's moving or not, focus it. If that subject has a face and eyes, it's going to lock on the face and eyes. It's always looking for faces, eyes, torsos. And it lets me say, this is the person that matters to me in the crowd. This is the animal that matters to me in the herd. This is the subject out in the street scene, the signpost that matters to me. And if I want something like AFS mode where it stays locked, I'm a back button focuser. I'm just going to take my thumb off that back button. I don't tie focus to my shutter button, with the exception of our action mode we're going to talk about in the next video. We'll get to that when we go into photo shooting bank B and custom setting bank B. I've got kind of a hybrid mode that combines shutter button focus with back button focus, but in general I'm just back button focusing. And in my normal mode, you know, I can stop focusing by taking my thumb off that AF on. I lock focus. If the subject's stationary, I can just take my thumb off and shoot, and it's not going to refocus. All right. Autofocus subject detection options. These are subjects. The auto mode looks for people first, animals second, vehicles third. It's a pretty good mode. If you know you're shooting people, jump into people mode. If you know animals are your subject, jump into animals. If you're shooting race cars on the track or freight trains coming down the line, throw it in vehicle mode. That way a person walking through doesn't distract you from your subject, because it's looking for people first in auto mode, and it'll take it off, you know, the animal that you're shooting if a person comes through the scene, or the race car that you're shooting if someone along the track walks along the wall. So, you know, it's good to have it in what you're looking for if you know, but auto mode's a pretty cool mode, especially for knockaround. This is my knockaround mode. Vibration reduction, that's the in-body image stabilization. This is a wonderful thing with mirrorless cameras, a huge boon for people that come from DSLR with great old lenses on the FTZ adapter that didn't have vibration reduction. Now, you get in-body image stabilization even with those lenses that help you handhold at slower shutter speeds. I leave that on. And you've got some modes in there. I leave it in normal. It's weird, this camera kind of puts it in sport by default. I put it in normal. So that's you can touch this, or you can use that right button on the wheel on the OK, push to the right of OK. Make sure it's on normal. Auto bracketing, there's a lot of choices in here. They've changed it from how it used to be. I like my increment to be 3 stops. And then when you do that, now you only have a choice of 3 or 5 frames around the meter. You can kind of see it represented down there, 3 or 5 frames. It used to be that you could go in one direction. You could go -2 on the meter and 1 3 stops underexposed, or -3, 1 on the meter, 1 3 stops underexposed, 1 6 stops underexposed. And I found that really handy, but I think Nikon got questions from people not understanding it. And so instead of explaining it or making it an option in the menu, they did away with it. And it bums me out, but there you have it. I can work with it. In general, I'm going to probably leave it at 3 frames. There's also a dedicated button up here on the top that lets you manipulate that. So no real need to be jumping into the menu for it. But you could lock it into a mode if you wanted a mode just for bracketing. If you wanted a bank to be a bracketing bank, I don't, but it's an option because it's here in the photo shooting menu. So you could put it into a photo shooting bank if you wanted to. Multiple exposure, just what it sounds like. It's got some cool options in here. How many exposures do you want? What kind of overlay blending mode do you want? Do you want to save the individual images? Do you want to see it happening on the screen as you're doing it? Pretty cool stuff. Explanations within it all. HDR, a lot of the similar kinds of stuff. I don't do in-camera HDR. I would rather capture multiple frames with bracketing and then blend those in post-production with a lot more control over the process. So that's my thing. Interval timer shooting, this is my time-lapse go-to mode. It gives you a lot of choices. You could start immediately. You can choose a time to start. You can choose your interval. You can choose the number of frames. You can choose whether you're going to have the camera in an automated mode and have it slowly smooth exposure as the light changes. Lots of cool stuff. Whether or not to focus, to put it in a separate folder, I would recommend putting it in a new folder and resetting the file numbering in general. So that's some great stuff. I also use it when I'm doing focus, when I'm doing star stacking, capturing say 10, 12 frames of the scene to reduce noise in post-production with Sequitur or Starry Landscape Stacker. Get into time-lapse video, that's in-camera time-lapse. It's going to compress it the same way video is compressed. It gives you a lot less control over the final product than capturing individual frames. Even JPEG frames give you a lot more control than having the camera make a time-lapse video for you and make all the decisions. So that's not something I'm going to use much. Focus shift shooting. Focus shift shooting is focus stacking. It's built into the camera. You can tell it how many maximum number of frames you want it to go, how far between each focus step you want to go. For landscape, you can go as low as, it'll show you right here. If you go into here, it tells you that the camera automatically takes photos at a set interval. Oh wait, the number of the focus step width. Narrow focus step width is way down at 1. If you're doing an image of just a bug's eye with a crazy macro lens, you want to set it down in that narrow range. If you're doing landscape stuff, I find 8 or 9 works great. So, it's just going to take several shots. You can tell it a maximum shot of 100, and then you just focus on the closest subject in your scene, and the camera will shoot, step out, shoot, step forward and focus, shoot, until it hits infinity or until it hits that number of shots that you programmed in. Really cool stuff. Again, I would have it put a new folder and reset the file numbering, just like doing interval timer shooting. All right, boom, there you go. Now, that's the end of our photo shooting menu. So we've rounded out all the things we want in photo shooting menu bank A. It's a good idea at this moment, now that you got those settings done, to run down here into the setup menu, and I went up instead of down toward the bottom. We're going to save our menu settings. Now we've just saved all of our work. It's locked in. If we change settings and we went here and said load menu settings, it'll load everything we just saved from the card. All right. Really quickly, you saw that I talked about how the photo shooting menu and the video recording menu are tied to one bank. That's why I have my standard Mode A that we just did in 4K 24. That's my video settings that I like. Well, coming over here, it's the same banks, right? So let's talk about how we set up that video shooting just to be 4K 24 frames. I'm not going to go too into depth about video. Same extended menu banks deal, same storage folder, file naming. Here's an important thing, destination. Card 2, this is where I set it to go to slot 2. So videos on slot 2, stills are on slot 1. Video file type, I'm just shooting an 8-bit for my standard knockaround. 10-bit gives you more dynamic range for situations like backlit sunrises or really intense light and shadows. Most of the time, I don't need it. It creates a much bigger file that's harder to edit, takes more computer processing power. I generally shoot in 4K. I don't really need 8K. I'm not doing IMAX movies where people are sitting 20 feet from the screen. So 3840 by 2160, and I love that filmic look of 24 frames a second, so I'm choosing the 24p. That's my setting that I shoot 99% of the time for video. There's a lot more settings. I'm not going to go through them all. A lot of the same kinds of things that we talked about affecting JPEGs affect video, and I often just let the camera use its normal or basic default mode. Flicker reduction, all that kind of stuff. Focus mode, I love the full-time autofocus with automatic area and subject detection, so that when I walk into the frame, it focuses on my face. When a subject walks through the frame, it's focusing on the human's face or the animal's face if you choose animal. Same kind of thing as it was in stills. Vibration reduction. Electronic vibration reduction is just even more vibration reduction built in by sort of steadying the image like GoPro does with just, cropping in on the image and doing reduction. You can turn that on if you need it. Rarely do I need it. There's a lot of audio stuff I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on. So those are the two. If you want to set video up, that's it. The next thing we're going to look into is custom settings. That's a whole nother set of banks. And I'm going to go in, we're going to talk about my standard bank. You'll see they're aligned. We're going to go through the A banks and custom settings just like we did the A banks and the shooting banks. You do have to sort of pay attention to both the custom settings banks and the shooting banks. Those are the two sets of banks. And I, to keep it simple, have kept them the same, standard action landscape astro. So you'll see when I'm setting these up, A is standard action landscape, astro is D. It's going to be the same for both. So we'll go through and we'll talk about all the different settings that are involved in custom settings. All right, so custom settings, again, we're in bank A, it's standard, that's what we're saving. You can name it exactly the same way. You can tap in here and just touch to name it. and we will copy these. We'll do a very quick set of videos on action, landscape, and astro. It's not going to be as long as this one. It's just going to copy all these settings from the custom settings banks and from the shooting banks into those other banks and then tweak them just for action, landscape, and astro. This is going to be a longer one. So we're going to run through all of my basic settings in the A custom settings bank. Focus. So, the way that Nikon works are you got A, B, C, D, E, F. Those are sort of quick jump ins, but you can see those arrows to the right mean that those are the main topics of a much larger menu. You jump in and you're at A1, A2, A3, A4. So we're going to talk about AFC priority selection. This is just saying that when I'm in autofocus continuous mode, when it's tracking subjects, it's more important to me that the shutter releases than that I'm in perfect focus. I want to capture those decisive moments. AFS priority selection, it's more important to me that it's focused when I'm locking focus. That's more of a landscape type mode. Focus tracking with lock on, that's all about, is your subject's motion steady or erratic, and how long, if the image is blocked by something that comes between you and your subject, does it delay before it jumps to find a new subject? So it'll have a little delay if, say, it runs behind a bush and pops back out on the other side of the tree or whatever. Again, you can find out all about these by just touching that little question mark up at the top right. So, I put that in my menu so that I can go in and change whether the subject's erratic or steady, or if I need to change those settings based on what I'm shooting. Focus points used, you can limit it. I find this camera so fast moving around with the joystick that I leave all the points in place. Store points by orientation. This is pretty cool. You can tell it that I want the focus point or even the focus in the AF area mode to be stored based on whether I'm shooting vertical or horizontal. And remember where it was when I was shooting vertical, and remember where it was when I turned to shoot horizontal. And that's a pretty cool thing, because sometimes you're shooting something that you want in the bottom right when you're vertical, but then the bottom right changes when you're horizontal. And so, you want to remember that point just jumps to the bottom right, whichever mode you're in as you move it around. That's pretty sweet. I love that. AF activation, this is off. This is where you go to back button. If I choose shutter AF on, then every time I touch the shutter button, it's going to be trying to focus. And I really feel like the shutter button should be for taking pictures, not focusing 90% of the time. We'll talk about the exception in the next video on setting up for action. So I leave it on AF on only, then I have to hit this back button to focus. And I think if you're a shutter focuser in general, you should really try a back button. I think shooting with it for a month, if you shoot a lot, you'll never go back. There's a reason why pros in general don't really use shutter button focus. Focus point persistence. This is a cool mode. I leave it on auto. What that means is that if you've picked up a focus point that has your subject and then you switch focus area modes, which we're going to talk about in action, it's kind of a rare thing, but you can actually program buttons to change and activate autofocus tracking and change the area mode that you're using while they do it. It'll hold on to the point from one type of focusing to another. So it just stays really persistent when you're tracking a subject. I leave that on auto. That's what works for me. Limit AF area mode selection. Now, I've heard that for sports, Nikon's recommending some dynamic area autofocus settings still. I just love the wide area autofocus settings and the 3D autofocus settings, and then for single servo autofocus when I'm doing landscape and stuff, I love the pinpoint and the single point. I don't use dynamic area. I find it more of a legacy mode. It doesn't work nearly as well for me as the wide area and 3D and auto area tracking, so I just turn those off. And you're still able to access them if you go into the I menu, but when you're making quick adjustments on the fly using a function button to switch autofocus modes, or using the autofocus button that's on the side of the camera up front here, it's going to just not have those in the rotation to flip through. And since there's 3 of them, I just turn them off. You can turn them off by just pushing the little arrow to the right, turn them on, and then when you hit the menu button, it locks it in. So coming back in here, now those are not options, and that's the way I like it. Focus mode restrictions. I like to use manual, continual, and single autofocus, so I don't restrict that. But you could set it up so that manual is not an option or continuous isn't an option. Focus point wraparound, that has never been a thing that works for me. It might work for you. It's kind of like when you're putting text in on a video game or something, you can go off the right side of the keyboard and it pops up on the left. Well, it's the same thing with your focus points. If you're over on the right and you want to get to the left, you can go off to the right and pop up on the left, or off the top and pop up at the bottom. It sort of confuses me. I'm just so used to being able to move around. I find myself in the wrong place. It's total preference. I leave it off. Focus point display. This tells you whether or not you want to see a focus point when you're in manual focusing mode. It can show whether you're in focus or not by the point. Dynamic area, autofocus assist. I leave these all on. You can play around with whether you like it or not. I really like seeing in autofocus continuous whether the point is locked in focus by it displaying the point. So that's totally up to you. Built-in AF assist illuminator, I leave that turned off. That's that little light that comes on to help in dark situations. More often than not, for the type of shooting that I do, that thing is distracting to my subjects, to other photographers. I just leave that turned off by default. It's A12 if you want to go back and turn it back on. Or you can put it in your mind menu if it's important to you. Focus peaking. I love focus peaking when I'm manually focusing. This is just a thing that's going to give you a little glowing edge to sharp parts of your image that are in focus when you're manually focusing. I find it distracting with some brands, cameras with their focus peaking setting, but Nikon has done a really great job of it. I leave that turned on. I leave it in its standard peaking mode. It's not distracting to me. And I like the color to be white. It's not as disturbing and distracting to me as red, yellow, or blue. It looks kind of natural, just like a little white shimmer on the edges of my sharp subjects. It's helpful manually focusing. The manual focus ring in autofocus mode, I leave that to be active so that if I change the manual focus ring, it can focus the camera still manually. I leave that on. Now we're getting into the B mode. B is metering and exposure. You can see it up at the top there. ISO sensitivity step value, 1/3. You could have it be a single step or a third step. I leave it at a third. EV steps for exposure control. A full step, half step, third step. I leave it at a third step. But you can change that. Easy exposure compensation, that just makes it so that you can do exposure compensation without pressing a button. I leave that off. I'd rather have to press a button. Matrix metering face detection. So that on or off, you get a little question mark here. The camera adjusts exposure. It takes into account human faces that are in the scene that it detects. The sensor's so smart, it knows when there's people, and it's going to try to keep from blowing out the people. It figures people are important to you. You can turn that on or off. I leave it on. Usually people are important to me. The center weighted metering area, you can tweak, how center weighted metering works. I don't use center weighted metering really, so if you do, there's a place to change it. Fine-tune optimal exposure. You can go in and change your exposure settings around. I find the camera does a great job by default. I've never needed to fine-tune my exposure. If you want to, you can. If you find the camera's exposing things more than you'd like, you can tone it down a bit. Vice versa. Keep exposure when f-stop changes. That's a thing in manual mode that'll override manual mode's kind of purpose for me of keeping everything steady. It might be nice in changing light at sunset where it just kind of constantly starts tweaking with your shutter speed or your ISO. I leave it turned off. I'm so used to just adjusting my camera as the light changes out in the landscape. But it's an interesting idea. It's really for manual mode. Shutter release, AEL button. I do not have auto exposure lock on the shutter button. If I'm moving around and shooting a fast sequence, I let it keep making exposure decisions while I'm shooting. But you could turn that on. Self-timer, this is where you can go in. Now, sadly, with this camera, we've lost exposure delay mode. I spent forever in the D section of this menu looking for exposure delay and going through the manual and looking through its index. And then I talked to my buddy David Archer. He said the same thing. Spent 15 minutes looking for it. It's gone. They figured without a shutter, you don't need exposure delay, but exposure delay was nice when you didn't want to use a cable release and you wanted to wait 0.2 seconds between shots, between pushing the button and shooting so that you didn't get handshake or half a second or a second. Well, now all you have for that is timer. You can choose how many shots. If you're doing it like I just described, single shot, but sadly, the fastest time you get with self-timer is 2 seconds. Some people will say, well, 2 seconds, what's that? Well, if you're doing a 20-frame panoramic merger at a little bit slower shutter speed that concerns you, well, that becomes 40 extra seconds in changing light that you don't need to spend. So anyhow, but it's important to have that. I'll put it in the My menu as well. Power off delay. This tells you it's about energy savings. The stock default settings are pretty good. I'm doing this review for you right now, so I have it set at infinity. I'm not gonna lock that in place. I have the menu set to 10 minutes. You're gonna want like 30 seconds and a minute or something like that. This has a nice big battery. Now we're into the D menu, shooting and display. This is where I was looking for the old exposure delay mode that I missed so much. Continuous shooting speeds. I like to leave my continuous high speed at the full 20 frame per second raw max, continuous low speed, 10 frames per second. And when I'm shooting motion, I generally leave it at that 10 frames a second. It's only when something is happening like a bird in flight that I want to capture that perfect wing moment, or somebody throwing a crazy inverted athletic trick and I want to get that perfect image. That's where I'm going to want 20 frames a second. Otherwise, you're just going to be culling through scads and scads and scads of images. We come down to the maximum shots per burst. I leave that at infinity. Why not? It's all digital electrons going into a card. Limit release mode selection. So there's a release mode selector up here now on our 4 king switch up at the top left. You got bracketing, you got mode, flash controls, and this release mode, which kind of does the same thing as spinning the little dial and pushing the button underneath it. And you can limit the selection modes of that. If you want to push that top button and click the wheel, you can use, I just leave them all up there. It's easy. Sometimes you just want to, in the dark, push down on that top button and rotate that back wheel to choose what release mode, whether you're in continuous low speed, continuous high speed, 30 frames a second, 120 frames a second. That's how you get into those modes. And to do it, you actually have to push this button and run over to the release mode setting. It's beyond the timer mode. So you've got your high speed continuous, low speed continuous, single frame, timer mode, and then release mode. And now whatever you push up at the top gets thrown in. You get all the same choices, except you also get 30 frames per second in the full resolution JPEGs, or 120 frames per second, 11 megapixel JPEGs. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting choice they did with that. I don't know why there's 2 different ways to do it, but just know you've got those 2 different ways, and you can limit the selection choices in this D3 menu. Sync release mode options. That's if you're working with multiple cameras and you want them to all fire synchronized. I'm not going to go into detail on that, but that's where you go to adjust that. Extended shutter speeds. I leave this turned on. If you leave this off like it is out of the box, then the maximum length of your shutter speed is 30 seconds. If you turn this on, as the little question mark will tell us, it'll take us all the way up to 900 seconds. That's 15 minutes of exposure. Great camera for long exposures. Again, I don't know why they got rid of exposure delay for modes like that and left us with the kind of lesser than timer mode, but it's capable of doing great long exposure work, and it's so cool to have 900 seconds. I leave that turned on. It goes through in a third of a stop, so it's pretty quick to rip through. You'll see, just play around with it. It's a great tool. Limit selectable image area. If you didn't want to be able to scroll through the selectable image areas at 1:1 and 16:9, or I don't know why, but you could limit that so it's quicker to switch between. File number sequencing, on or off. I leave that turned on. If you hit the question mark, it just chooses how it's assigning file numbers when a new memory card is inserted. Does it continue with the number that it was before, which I think is nice when you're going through and putting files into the computer, or does it start over with a new card? Your choice. Totally depends on how you organize. View mode. Photo live view. So do you want to see the effects of the setting on your image? I think that's one of the most brilliant things about mirrorless cameras and about using live view in the DSLR cameras, is that you are seeing the effects of exposure on your image live as you're setting it up. So, you can turn that off, which kind of gives you an easier view of your scene sometimes, but I tend to always leave that on, particularly in my standard mode. So photo LV. Starlight view. This is an interesting one. This creates a little bit noisier image in dark conditions, but you can see the landscape on starless nights to an extent where it's easier to compose your image, and it gives you an even greater amount of low light focusing capability. Several more stops than even the great Z7 II and Z6 II. So I was playing around with it in Baja recently and was able to focus on bright stars, not just planets on a moonless night. It's distracting a little bit while it's turned on. This is a thing that I want in my Milky Way shooting menu to have easily accessible. When I'm in that menu bank, we'll talk about it in the video where I'm talking about setting up for night photography in Milky Way. But you know, it's cool to know that it's there at D9. Warm display colors. Likewise, if I turn this on, you're gonna be blown away by what it looks like. Go into mode 2. In mode 2, even if I hit the play button, I get a normal view of what's going on, but I have red light menus to not hurt my eyes. If I go in to warm display colors mode 1, then everything is red, even the images that I'm previewing. Crazy, huh? All right. So those are great tools in Milky Way. We'll talk about them in the Milky Way settings. But for my normal sort of walk around shooting, I'm going to leave that those warm display settings on off. That way I can see what I'm doing better in daylight. And you can even tweak the display brightness while you're in that warm display. LCD illumination, you can always check. I forgot what this one does, to be honest with you. It chooses whether the control panel and back buttons, oh, that's right. Basically, when you're turned on, all these buttons on the camera can backlight and illuminate, and this is a mode where it just leaves them illuminated all the time, which burns more battery. All you have to do is take the on switch and turn it a little past on, and all those buttons light up. So they light up for about 5 or 10 seconds. It's super handy. I don't see a need to have them lit up all the time, burning battery. View all in continuous mode. This one is about whether or not you continue to view images as you're capturing them in continuous mode. I'm all about leaving that on so that I see what I'm doing while I'm shooting in continuous mode. I'm not sure the reason for turning that off. Release timing indicator. So the release timing indicator, there are several different timing indicators, and it actually gives you a description without even hitting a question mark, because this is new to everybody. There's no shutter in here, so there's a straight up blackoutless view of what you're shooting while you're shooting. So I like mode B, little lines that occur at all 4 edges of the frame as the image is being captured. It happens really fast, flickering when you're in 20 frames a second. Type A, the screen goes dark. That's what we're trying to avoid. I don't want blackout. Type A is like, let's add blackout back in. Type C is even less obtrusive. It's just the left and right edges of the frame have a little light that comes on or off. Or you can turn it off and you don't see anything happening when you're capturing images. I have played with all 3. I like Type B. You can play around with them, see what you like. The image frame, that's just whether or not you see a frame around the image. You can go in, turn that off and on. I like having it on, sort of shows me what I'm framing as opposed to what the settings on the camera are. Kind of delineates the display in the viewfinder from the image itself. The grid type, do you want a grid on your camera? What kind of grid do you want? I like the traditional rule of thirds grid, 3x3. You can change that around. Virtual horizon type, I love this new A type. B type is kind of the old DSLR style that we used to have in live view and in the viewfinder on some cameras. A is really nice. That's what I'm using. You can choose either one that you like better. Custom monitor shooting display. So this is a cool thing. We're gonna go deep into here. You can set this, each of these 5 pages up. I only have 4 that I'm using. You can see 1 is unchecked. If I move my sort of D-pad over to the right, I can say, what do I want in there? You can see I don't have a whole lot selected. I have nothing selected in my base one, my display 1. It's just blank. I get to see nothing but the scene. Display 2, I have chosen to add in the touch controls on the screen, the virtual horizon and the histogram, and the rule of thirds grid view. That's all I've chosen on display 2. You can go in, check, uncheck those boxes, set it up how you want it to be. Display 3, I have everything. Simple information. You can see it turning on and off when I go to the right. Detail, on and off. You can also touch the little box on the touch screen. The touch controls, the virtual, everything. I have everything except the little center indicator. I don't really need the center indicator. Especially with the grid view, it's just kind of obvious to me, so I don't put that in there. And then I don't use anything for display 4, and display 5 is sort of set, as this is a great tripod display when you're out shooting to just quickly go through and change settings and see your settings in the dark without looking up through the viewfinder. And you can access all these when you're out shooting by just hitting the display button. Here you can see I'm in that tripod sort of mode, settings mode. Here's my blank view. There's you guys in the camera. Here's my just histogram, rule of thirds, and touch controls with the virtual horizon. Here's everything. Back to where we started. Okay, so that's all set up. The viewfinder has similar settings. I have it set to be blank. You only have 4 choices, but it's exactly the same stuff. I don't need to reinvent the wheel there. I have a blank one. I have one with just the rule of thirds, the virtual horizon, and the histogram. And I have one with all my shooting data. That's all I need. Okay. Flash sync speed. You got some choices in here. There's a kind of stuttery flash thing that you can do to get higher flash sync speed by it sort of stuttering it as the sensor reads its information. That's the auto FP. I tend to just leave it at its kind of base 1/200th of a second. If I needed to use that faster shutter speed to use flash, I would play around with that. But in general, I think 1/200th is a good. Flash shutter speed, the lowest, you can choose the lowest flash shutter speed. You can go way low if you want. I tend to leave it around a 60th of a second unless I have a need to do long exposure photography with flash. It's just your slowest shutter speed it's gonna work with. Exposure compensation for flash, that you can choose whether it's the entire frame that's being chosen for metering or whether it's just the background. Entire frame takes into account your subject and your background. The background only is just going to underexpose for the background while letting the flash light your subject as, on the meter, essentially. A lot of flash stuff. We're not going to go into too much depth. Auto ISO sensitivity control. When you're using auto ISO, is it looking more at the subject than the background, or both the subject and the background equally? I tend to leave it on subject and background, or subject only. Actually, I think subject only is kind of cool. But that's only for flash. What's the ISO for your subject? When we're doing flash photography, the whole focus is on the subject. Modeling flash is going to kind of send whatever off-camera flash you're using or on-camera flash a little look at what your setup is. I leave that turned off. Auto bracketing mode manual. So we've talked about the flash and then the speed. This is all flash settings. Do you want it to use flash then speed then aperture, flash then aperture? I just use flash then shutter speed. Bracketing order. I like the normal bracketing order where it shows the first image is on the meter, then the underexposed image, then the overexposed image. It gets confusing if you have it do under the meter, on the meter, over the meter when you're bracketing, because the first image looks really underexposed. You need to think about, if you're doing 3 stops underexposed and then on the meter and then 3 stops overexposed, you have to make sure the first one's 3 stops underexposed to get it to work out right. If you just leave it normal, you bracket on the meter and it does the next shot under and the next shot over. Trust me, it's confusing if you take it out of normal. If you want it out of normal, take it out of normal. Flash burst priority. This is all flash stuff I'm going to have you go through if you're actually doing flash. Let's talk more just about non-flash settings. So let's talk about customizing some stuff. This is going to be a little deeper dive. We'll go in. We're going to customize our iMenu for remember, this is our A bank. This is the normal mode. And we're going to propagate these customized iMenu and control settings that we do through the other mode banks, through the custom settings banks and shooting banks by just copying these banks over. So it'll be much faster when we go through the second time, but I'm going to go into detail about how I customize the iMenu and the control menu for my normal shooting mode. All right, so for my normal iMenu setup, what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you how this works. You go over to the right, or you touch the iMenu setup on the back panel, but if you click to the right, you jump in and you can choose what you want in each one of these areas. So the way you change things is by hitting the OK button or tapping it, and then you can scroll up and down through all the options. All right, and there are many options, and I'm just going to show you what I've chosen. So I've chosen choose image area, the metering mode, vibration reduction, so you can change that on or off, long exposure noise reduction, the shooting menu in the custom menu settings bank, front and center, so we can flip between our banks, whether we're shooting, suddenly going to work on landscape on the tripod. Well, let's go into bank C. We're going to be shooting action. Let's go into bank B for both custom and shooting menus. Silent mode can be really, really handy at times. Monitor viewfinder brightness. Sometimes you're working in lower lit situations and you want to turn the monitor down. Focus shift shooting. If I just touch that, it takes me into the focus shift settings to do focus stacking. Interval timer shooting. If I'm doing star stacking or time lapse, boom, I'm into it. The autofocus mode, whether it's manual focus, autofocus C, or autofocus S, and then the area mode and subject detection settings. All right there in our iMenu. That's how I set mine up. Okay, now let's talk about customizing controls while we're out shooting the camera. There are a lot of buttons that are programmable on this camera. The first one is this function 1 button that's sort of under my middle finger when I'm shooting in horizontal mode. And I put that to exposure lock. It's auto exposure lock. If I am shooting something where the sky is the important part to me and I want some blackened foreground and I don't want the foreground to really be taken into account, I'll make sure that the sky fills my frame. I hold that button down, recompose with it locked on exposure for the sky, and let the foreground go to silhouette. It's rare I use that, but sometimes I do. Bracketing, burst. So what this actually does is when I'm in bracketing mode, let's say I'm in single frame capture, and I'm in bracketing mode, I've chosen I want 3 frames, 3 stops apart on either side of the meter. If I hold down this function 2 button, the one that's under my ring finger here, that middle of those 3 buttons on the front, while I hit the shutter button, say I'm hand holding really still to go bap, 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 it'll shoot all 3 of them, high speed, as fast as it can go. And that's just handy so that you can hand hold bracketed scenes if you're being really careful, especially with wider angle lenses. The next one's function 3, that's the bottom one. I put that to change, by pushing that button and rotating the wheels, I can change the autofocus mode and the area mode. So I can go from 3D tracking to auto area or 3D tracking to wide subject. Sometimes you want to change fast while you're looking through the frame. You don't even want to move your hand off the long lens back to this button. It emulates this button on the front. That's the autofocus settings button. But if you push that button and rotate the front wheel, you change the autofocus area mode. If you rotate the back wheel, you change the autofocus mode. I put that on this bottom button up front, the function 3 button, because I can reach it with my middle finger when I'm shooting vertically, and I can reach it with my ring finger when I'm shooting horizontally, and it's accessible in either shooting position. That button, whatever you want the most, you put on that button because you can grab it from either grip mode. You know, another little quick tip for you guys about grip modes, turn that vertical shooting grip off when you're not using it, or you'll find yourself, at least for me with my big hands, I'm constantly shooting images by accidentally bumping its shutter button. There's an off switch. You can lock it so that it doesn't work. And it locks out all the vertical controls. It's handy. All right, there's a function button up for the vertical grip, and I make that button to be depth of field preview, because I told you this camera doesn't show you apertures smaller than f5.6 unless you hit the depth of field preview button. So I make that function button up by the shutter button on the vertical grip, depth of field preview. Function 4 button, that's up here in the top left in the back where the play menu used to be. I know a lot of people that are coming from the DSLR are tempted to put the play menu back there because they're used to it. But think about it, when you're shooting with a long lens and you want to just see what the last shot looked like through your viewfinder, it's nice to just be able to move your thumb down to that play button and keep looking through the viewfinder instead of bringing your hand back and having that big lens floating out in space hitting the button like it was for the Z6 and the Z7 and the Z50. Or the Z50 had it in the right place. The ZFC kept it in the wrong place. So what I like for function 4 that's really handy for me is the minute that I hit it, it goes to the top menu item in my menu. And I'll talk about the importance of what that top menu item is when I set up my iMenu. You want it to be a my menu item that doesn't have a submenu, or else it jumps immediately into the submenu. I don't know why Nikon did that. I just want it to be in my menu up at the top. So you got to put something at the top of my menu that doesn't have a submenu. We'll talk about that when we set up the my menu. Then I set up the AF on button. These are all the same, by the way, as choosing what goes in the iMenu. You hover over it and touch it or hit the OK button, and you go into this whole list to choose from, scrolling up and down. I'm going to just hit the back button. So my AF on button, I want it to just be AF on in this mode, standard. I want it to do back button focusing. I reprogrammed this. If I push the little joystick, the little knurled joystick, either in the vertical one or the horizontal one, if I push in on the center, I want it to center my focal point, to put it right in the center of the frame. So I can jump from the left side to the middle to the right and then move to the right. It's a real quick way, or just center that point up just by tapping that. They usually, by default, that's on the OK button. That doesn't make as much sense to me. For the OK button, I choose to have it zoom, and I have it, there's a sub-menu, I choose to have it zoom to 100% magnification to check focus. That's a really handy thing. So that's what I have the OK button. I reprogrammed those two. There's a voice memo button that really only records voice memos when you're in playback mode. It's handy in playback mode. I have it set that if I hold it down while I'm working on the tripod, let's say I'm using a neutral density lens and I want to quickly reduce my exposure by 10 stops and throw a 10-stop neutral density lens in there, by holding that button down and rolling one of my exposure control wheels in manual mode or aperture mode or shutter priority mode, it's going to move by stops instead of a third of a stop just while I'm holding that button down. It's just a shortcut. It's handy, something kind of fun. I was looking through thinking there's so many function buttons. That's a handy one, doing long exposures. The quality button, I leave quality. I can change whether I'm shooting raw. That's down here. You can see them highlighted on the screen. It's that middle button on the bottom. That's going to change whether I'm shooting raw JPEG, what size JPEG, what quality. The vertical multi-selector, again, same thing. I have to reprogram that one for the vertical grip to reset the focal point, the focus point to the center. The AF on button down below for the vertical grip is just AF on. The movie button up on the top, it doesn't work to shoot movies when you're in stills mode. Unless you flip this lever into video mode, the movie button is inactive. So I set that to be depth of field preview. I'm not shooting when I check depth of field preview, so that finger, that shutter finger, can just move over to the movie button and touch that to do depth of field preview. Boom, it's right there. Now, likewise, you can change your command dials all around. If I hit this, there's a whole bunch of changes. You can change, which wheel does what for program, shutter speed, aperture. You can customize this to your heart's content. You can change whether you're choosing the area mode or the focus mode with the front and back wheel when you're doing that shortcut button that I put on function 3 that also has the autofocus button up here in the front. You can switch around. You can just do all kinds of customizing of how the command dials work. Your lens function button. Your lens function button has, some lenses have 2 function buttons like this big 100 to 400 and my 70 to 200. I like the original lens function button. If I have a lens that has only 1 lens function button like this 24 to 120 that's on my camera right now, I like it to be play. I can just easily click, I hit play. It's as easy as it's even easier than moving my thumb down to the play button on the bottom right corner of the camera down here. It's just easily accessible on the lens while I'm holding a long lens. I like the front, if there's a dual function button on the lens, so the lens function 2, I just have it be an AF on button. Another way, lens button focus instead of back button focus. It's just another way to focus really quickly and easily and frees up my right hand even more. So that's just a trick. I've been doing that for a long time. It's what I'm used to. You can play around with other things to put on the lens function buttons. For me, play button's most important, autofocus on is a secondary. You can choose what the custom function dial on a lot of these S lenses does. I like it to just control aperture. And there you go. Those are my custom settings that are my stock custom settings. We'll tweak those a little bit when it comes to shooting action, but that's my basic settings. When I'm doing playback, I don't do a whole bunch of tweaking. You can have different buttons do different things while you're in playback mode. I think I changed the quality mode to add a star, and you can tell it how many stars you want. I just had to add 1 star. You can do all kinds of fun stuff with this. Just run through, play around with it, see what you want to do. I don't use too many buttons when I'm doing my playback review, but it gives you a whole bunch of choices. Control lock. What was control lock again? Lock, shutter speed, aperture, or shutter speed and aperture. This option has no effect in program mode. It just is going to lock off Yeah, I don't know. I don't know why you'd want that. Oh, yeah, no idea. But you can research that. Sorry, that's one that I'd have to pull up and read through the manual on. It's not something I've ever used. If you find it useful, drop a hint in the comments. But you know, I just don't see myself locking things. I want to be able to manipulate things in those modes. Reverse dial rotation, you can choose whether you want that for shutter speed and aperture exposure compensation. I'm very used to Nikon's standard system. Release button to use dial. You can set it so that you, normally when you touch a button and roll a wheel, it changes things. You can set it so that you have to press the button once and then you can just roll the wheels without holding the button down and then press the button again to turn it off. I've never done that. It's been an option for a long time on Nikon cameras. Reverse your exposure indicators. To me, left being underexposed and right being overexposed makes sense, but maybe you're coming from another brand that does it backwards to what I'm used to. You can change it if you want. Reverse the ring for focus you can do. It's pretty crazy. There's so much customization. Focus ring rotation range. Control ring response. I leave it on high. Full frame playback flicks. Those are things that you can tell it to do when you're flicking left or right or up or down. I leave it flick to advanced direction, but the up and down kind of bothers me. It doesn't do anything for me. You can, while you're reviewing images, you can just flick the image up and down. So then you go into some of the video modes. You can customize your video menu. I'm going to show you really fast what's in there. Very, very fast. I have picture control, active de-lighting, electronic vibration reduction, frame size, the shooting menu bank, metering, the image area, microphone sensitivity, headphone volume, subject detection, and area mode and autofocus mode. That's what I'm using. Custom controls for video. I'm not really going to go into this. I have some custom controls, but this is really more of a stills tutorial. I'll tell you what. You can look at it. You can freeze the frame. I'll scroll down through them. You can have a look at what I'm doing. I actually set my function 2 and function 3 button to be power aperture, so it smoothly motors through the different apertures, and I can kind of change it while I'm shooting if I want. You can get an idea there. Slow move through. You can decipher what they all are. You know, if anybody really wants a video tutorial on setup, you know, that's another thing. Again, control locks, limit the area. It's all those same kinds of things. Autofocus speed is important. Focus mode, it tells it how fast it's keeping up with subjects that are moving in the frame. I find that the default is pretty great, but if I was shooting fast moving action with video, I might choose to tweak with this a little bit. AF tracking sensitivity, you know, setting it at the defaults has been great for me so far. Viewing assist, I can't remember what viewing assist does actually. Let's have a look. That's why we keep our reference guide up and handy on our portable device. So we're in G8. Let me just run through the menu. I'm in G. If I hit 685, it's going to tell me. For a live preview of video footage recorded, hyperlog gamma. This is for log video shooting. It's really advanced. I'm going to leave it turned off. This is for really high bit rate, kind of HDR video type stuff. Zebra pattern, I love having the zebra pattern. I put the tone range to high, which means it's only going to show me the bright highlights. You can choose what pattern you want, and the highlight threshold 250 is, if you're thinking about RGB colors, 250, 250, 250. Remember 255, 255, 255 is pure white. It's going to warn me when parts of my image are hitting that 250 point threshold. So cool stuff. I like that view when I'm shooting video. Anyhow, you get the idea. I like a grid. You can customize your monitor and your viewfinder, all the same kinds of stuff. So that's our custom settings menu, and we have that all saved in a custom settings bank. You have to actually hit the left arrow button to get back, or you'd hit that little return button, and I've saved that all in bank A. Now we're going to copy that bank into bank B. We're not going to go back through and set all of these settings that we want set. We'll just go into bank B, which is going to be action, and we will copy bank A into bank B. I'll show you how to do that. Name it action, and then we'll just tweak the settings that we want different for action. Same thing for landscape, same thing for astro. The second, third, and fourth videos are going to be very short by comparison. All right, so now that we've got all that stuff set up, again, I think saving and loading menu settings, let's save our menu settings so we don't lose our work. So we're locked in. If we were to go back and hit load, we'd be right where we are now before we jump in and look at the playback menu, the setup menu, the network menu, and show you how I load up my menu. All right, everybody, we're on a quick glide path now. We're going to run fast through the playback menu and the setup menu. Remember, these are not locked into banks. This is the only time we're running through these is in this video. We're not going to run through it in the next videos. Any of the rest of this stuff is just going to be universal in all of the shooting banks and custom settings banks. That stuff's all covered, the things that are fit in the banks. All this stuff is universal that we're setting now. It doesn't get adjusted by changing banks, okay? All right, so here we are. We've got your delete. That actually goes through and you can choose whether to delete selected pictures or the ones that you marked for deletion or all of them on a selected date or all pictures. I'm gonna put that in my menu and I'll tell you why a little bit later. Your playback folder, you're gonna go through, what folder are we going through? All of them is my general rationale. Playback display options. I don't like a whole bunch to cycle through with the display button. It's the same as when you're shooting and looking at the different shooting views in the monitor and the viewfinder. You can go through different display options, and you do that with the up and down arrow around the OK button. And I like to have the RGB histogram and none. Those are my playback views that I like to have. And that gives you a view like, there's some display information. There's your red, green, and blue histogram, which I use all the time to check exposure. And then the clean view, so those are your options. I live in this mode and this mode. Those are the two I like to see. Clean and what's my exposure look like. All right, so back into the menu. Delete pictures from both slots. That's only if you're backing things up to both slots. You can choose whether to or not. Dual format recording playback slot. I do allow that for slot 1. Filtered playback criteria. You could, if you want to do filtered playback, it's an option when you're in playback. I choose rating because I do have that thing set where if I hit the quality in playback mode, it adds a star to my images. Picture review. That's whether or not the image is going to come up after you take the shot. And you can set it to be on in general or on only when you're using the back monitor. So maybe your tripod mode, if you like that. I tend to leave it off. I'd rather have to hit the play button to see my image and not have it interrupt my shooting. After delete, this is one that I love that Nikon came out with a long time ago, and that's continuous before. When I'm in playback mode, if I'm going backwards through my images and I delete one, instead of going to the one I just looked at, the next image, it'll go to the previous one. If I'm moving from right to left, it continues moving after delete to the left. If I'm moving from left to right, it continues moving to the right. It's a really great thing. I love that. After the burst, what do you want to see? The last picture in the burst is my choice. You could choose to see the first. Rotate tall. I leave that turned off. A lot of people leave it turned on, but you've got this sort of, landscape-oriented monitor and viewfinder, and if you choose to rotate the tall images to view when you're in landscape, it makes them small. It makes them really narrow and only as tall as they would normally be wide. I'd rather have to turn the camera and look at it and see a bigger view and a better representation. I can turn my head or turn the camera. Copy images, you can actually copy images around. We don't need to do that. So there you go. That's the playback menu. Told you that'd be quick. Our setup menu, that's where our load and save menu settings are. Format the memory card, that's one that I used to use a ton and I'm not using so much anymore. We'll talk about why. The reason for that is I like to save all of my menu settings to the memory card, and if I format it, I delete those saved settings. So I use that delete all images instead, and I keep that in my menu. Language, that's just going to go through and set up that you're in English or whatever language is your area. Time zone and date. You can have it set this stuff up from your GPS that's built into this camera if you want to. Monitor brightness. That's I put that in my eye menu. Monitor color balance you can tweak. Viewfinder brightness, I leave that on auto generally. It works great. Viewfinder color balance, I just leave standard, but you can go in and change it. Finder display size with live view, I leave that at standard. Why would I want it at small? I like my finder display size to be big. Limited monitor mode selection. You can go in the current state that's not available. I think that's because I don't know exactly why, but it's not something I've ever messed with. Auto rotate the information display. That's something new with the Z9 that's pretty darn cool. When you go into vertical shooting, all the shooting information and your overview display that you have set up flips into a vertical orientation, so that instead of having to look at it sideways because it's up straight from the bottom to the top, it all flips and you see all your settings and everything right side up while you're shooting in portrait mode. I leave that on, it's cool. Fine tuning autofocus, you can just sort of in general fine tune different lenses that you're using. I find I rarely need to do that with the lenses that I'm shooting with mirrorless. Mirrorless lenses on mirrorless cameras just tend to need no autofocus fine tuning since they're running off the sensor. In the DSLR age, this was really important, particularly with long lenses. Non-CPU lens data. This is if you're using an old lens, you can tell the camera what focal length and maximum aperture it has, and then it can meter it properly. Like an old manual focus AIS Nikon lens. I have an old 400 3.5. And you can just go in there and tell it, you know, that this lens number 1 is a 400. I'll just hold it down until I get to 400. 400, and then its maximum aperture is f3.5. Okay, and then if I mount that lens, I just need to go to number 1. Save focus position. This is super cool. This came as firmware update for the Z6 and Z7 when the Z6 II and Z7 II launched. It's something I love. It's that when you turn off the camera with one of these fly-by-wire, focus-by-wire lenses, it remembers where the lens was focused instead of defocusing. When you turn it off and turn it back on, it goes back to where it was when you turn the camera off or changed batteries, for example. Sensor shield behavior at power off. This is one I cannot for the life of me explain why they set it up this way, but they set it out of the box to not leave the little shield in place when you pull a lens off. You just see the sensor under there. I set this to on. The little shield closes when you turn the camera off, and it protects the sensor from dust when you're changing lenses. Turn this one on. You put it in your eye menu to be able to clean your sensor. If you get dust in your sensor, you just turn it off and then take the lens off with it turned off, clean your sensor, put your lens back on, turn it back on. Clean image sensor, that's just telling, I like to have automatic cleaning set to clean it shut down. So that's what that means. It's not turned off, it means it's gonna clean the sensor, vibrated at really high intensity every time I turn the camera off. And you can also tell it to do it right now. You hold it upside down and run it before you go cleaning your sensor. Dust off reference photo, you can take an image that's supposed to be cleaning, you know, when your sensor's cleaning, use it as a reference image. Pixel mapping, kind of a complicated little thing that will optimize image processing functions from the image sensor. I haven't gotten a whole bunch of explanation about what this pixel mapping does. I ran it once with a full battery, seems to work great. I mean, the camera's got such a beautiful sensor. I haven't needed to do any pixel mapping. I didn't see any cause, but I ran it since it was there. Image comment, you can input a comment using the voice memo. Copyright information, I like to enter my copyright information, my name and all rights reserved. Not a bad idea to just append in there. IPTC, whether or not you want to load certain metadata in, I'll let you explore that further. Voice memo options. The voice memo control, when you're doing playback of your images, you can hit that voice memo, hold it down, and leave yourself a voice note about the image. And it's pretty handy. I've used it a little bit. Camera sounds, whether you want the shutter sound on or off. I kind of like the shutter sound on. I leave the beep turned off, and I keep the volume very low and the pitch low so it's not annoying. But I think that having it on is kind of handy so that you know you're shooting. When you go into silent mode, it's gone, and I leave that on my eye menu so it's easy to get to. Touch controls, I like having the touch controls. I like being able to move through the menu by just touching and moving around on it. HDMI, these are settings about what's happening with HDMI output. Say you're using an external monitor or an external recorder, kind of complicated video type stuff. I'm using it right now to output what my video is doing into my computer and record what I'm talking about. USB connection priority. This is about whether you want it to show up as a drive on your computer or be controlled by it. You know, you can go in and change around the different types of what you want done when you connect via USB. Location data, there's a built-in GPS receiver. Do you want to record location data? Turn that on. I tend to leave it off. I don't always want location data. Sometimes I'm places that are sensitive. I want to be able to turn it off. I know where that is all the time. I can turn it on and turn it off. I'm not sure how I feel about always having GPS location like I do on my phone. But if I'm shooting someplace that is not harassed by photographers a ton and it's a little bit of a secret spot that I just don't want to share with the entire world, I'll make sure this is turned off. And you can set the clock from the satellite, which I do kind of dig. Wireless remote control, that's if you connect up a wireless remote control, which is going to be more frequently needed without exposure delay. And you can assign whatever wireless remote control function buttons are in there. Conformity marking, that's just making sure that it passes some tests and it's showing you that. You can know about what's going on with your battery. I've been running this whole time. I forgot my battery was worn down before I started this, so I'm running off my little Anchor battery brick. This holds about 6 of this camera's $230 batteries inside it, and it costs like $70. I have it in my links at hudsonarea.com/ATS links, and it'll run your camera for days off a single charge. This is a 20,000 milliamp battery bank from Anchor with power delivery, so it just runs the camera. But you can see my battery's down to 12%. How old is the battery? It's new. So that's all good stuff. USB power delivery, that's what I'm doing right now with this cord. You want that turned on so that you can power your camera from USB. As long as you have power delivery capable battery like this one from Anchor, I recommend. Energy saving photo mode, I leave that turned off. This battery is huge. If I was out on a long remote trip and I didn't have very many batteries, maybe I could see turning it on. It just saves power. Slot empty release lock. They leave this thing enabled when no memory card in it out of the box. It's its default state. I like to lock it so I don't go around shooting thinking I'm taking pictures when I don't have a memory card in. It won't let me take a photo without a memory card. Save, load, menu settings. Let's do that one more time. We're going to save our menu settings. All I have to do is come back here. That's saved to my CF Express card in the slot. So now anytime I want to go back and load, I load. That's why I'm not formatting my cards. I'm constantly updating my menu settings as I get them tweaked to how I like. Or let's say I'm out shooting and I change a whole bunch of stuff in one of my banks. I can get back right to it by just loading the menu settings back in. And this saves all the menu settings, not just the banks. The menu that we're in right now, the setup menu, it gets saved. Reset all settings, that would take you back to factory default. We're not going to do that. What firmware version and how do we update? That's all in here. And then I'm in the latest one. You can update that from your SnapBridge app, which is really handy to just connect up to your tablet or your smartphone. Our network menu, you've got an airplane mode to stop it from communicating. You've got a wired local area network, an Ethernet line, which is great for AP stringers and news shooters, war correspondence. Connect to smart device, you can just link it up, it's connected. I connect it to my Google Pixel 5 and offload images, connect to the smartphone's clock, GPS, whatever else. Connect to a computer, connect to an FTP server. It's got tons of connection stuff. Connect to other cameras that are network enabled. It's got so much interesting, cool networking capabilities all right there. Probably the most useful one for me in that is airplane mode and connect to smart device, but pretty darn cool. Now let's talk about My Menu. My Menu, I'm going to start at the bottom of the My Menu because that's where all the power is. You can add items. I've added as many items as I can to my Menu. You can remove items if you decide you don't want one anymore. You hit that remove and then a right click checks that I would remove airplane mode. If I hit delete on the back, it would delete it. If I hit the right arrow again, it unselects it. You can also tap it. You can rank the items. That lets you move them around. If I want to move airplane mode, I click it. Now it's highlighted, and I can say I want to put it there or there, in that little place where the little line goes. I'm just going to leave it alone. And you can create tabs if you want, tabs and sub-tabs for your menu. I haven't gone ahead and done that. Well, actually, you can choose between whether you're in your recent settings or you're in My Menu. Recent settings just shows you all the most recent settings. The My Menu is the one that you program yourself. I love the My Menu and programming it myself. Now, I have airplane mode up at the top of My Menu. It may not be my most frequently used My Menu choice, but you notice it doesn't have a sub-menu. There's no thing that goes off to the right. Because I programmed this function 4 button to jump to the top of my menu whenever I need it, if it has a submenu, it jumps into the submenu. So if I hit that function 4 button and location data was there, I would find myself here instead of in the My menu. I don't know why Nikon programmed it that way, but that's the way that it is. It goes into the top thing in My menu. So I just leave airplane mode up there. I can turn it on, turn it off. Right now it's on. I tend to actually leave my GPS locating turned on, and if I don't want it, I put it in airplane mode, and that's going to turn it off. That's why it was off right now. Location data built in, I can record location data. You see, I can turn it on and off right there. That's set. Video file type, since that isn't available in the I menu for video, I don't know why. I can go in and I can choose whether I'm in 10-bit or in ProRes 10-bit, or whether I'm shooting 8-bit, which is kind of my standard gig. My self-timer, if for some reason I want to deviate from that 2-second self-timer, I want more shots, I want more interval between shots, I want a longer timer, I can get right in there and change that. Delete, I put this in here now, I can delete all pictures instead of formatting the card, and I can choose which card I'm deleting from when I go into there. It's handy so that I'm not deleting those saved menu settings that are on my cards. It just deletes the images. Save and load menu settings, boom, there it is. Save it one more time. Connect to smart device, that just lets me connect up. If SnapBridge isn't automatically connecting, I can go in here to just kind of speed it up. Focus tracking with lock on. The reason I put that in there is to change the response time if necessary and to switch from steady to erratic if I need to. Starlight view, I told you that's an important one for Milky Way shooting, and it lets you focus in lower light and see lower lit compositions. Warm display colors, once again, great in the Milky Way to give you that red light view. Flash control, great if you're working with external flashes. Silent mode, easy to just go dead quiet. Set picture control, that if I'm shooting in video, or this is photo picture control, lets me change out of that flat view if I'm shooting JPEGs that matter to me. Quick, get there without having to search around for it. Power off delay, because I do these videos a lot, I want to be able to jump in and change this from infinity to a 1-minute standby timer, and from 10 minutes for menus to 30 seconds. HDMI out, because I do a lot of HDMI out type of things. I can change my preferences around for that, whether it's to send video or whether it's to send what's going on with my camera's menus. Monitor brightness, viewfinder brightness, AF activation, which is whether I want to map it to the shutter button. Sometimes you hand your camera to someone and you know they're not going to do well with back button focus. I'll just put it on the shutter to hand it to someone. So it's nice to have it right there in my menu. I hit the function 4, scroll down, turn it on, shutter button, and turn it back off when I get it back. Clean the image sensor right before I'm going to physically blow out my image sensor, or if I'm seeing dust on there, I'll hit clean image sensor right here. Sensor shield behavior at power off, that lets me turn that off so that I can turn the camera off and it still leaves my sensor exposed to clean. And that's it. That's my menu. That's all the menus. And that's what I program. We've gone through all these lower menus. We've got them set. Once you've locked all those in, you're out here shooting, go into your My menu, go down to Save Load Menu Settings and save those menu settings. We've got them all locked. And we have gone through and looked at what is in Custom Settings Bank A and what is in the Shooting Menu Bank A. The Shooting Menu Bank is the same, locks in everything in the photo shooting menu and video recording menu. The Custom Settings menu locks in everything in the custom settings. All right, so I hope you enjoyed. I hope you check out my other videos. Every Thursday I do a video that's a little less dry and technical, I would hope. We have a good time. Join up on my office hours. You can check those out at hudsonhenry.com/office hours. The gear that I use and stand by is all listed at my ATS links website, hudsonhenry.com/ATS links. Hit me up. I'm easy to get a hold of. I love to hear your thoughts about this setup video. You guys drive the content of my YouTube channel. So thanks so much for watching.